there! I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be the Reading My Country tag. This tag was created by Cook Read Create, and I will link the original video below. And I was tagged by Sean the Book Maniac, and I will link his channel below as well. Question number 1 is, what country are you going to talk about? I originally was going to have a bit of a dilemma for this because I do have more than one nationality, but ultimately Sean said a couple of things about one of my favorite authors, never mind favorite Canadian authors, in his video that I felt like I needed to respond to. So I'll be talking about Canada. Question number 2 is, what is your favorite childhood book from your country? And I feel like a huge number of people pick Anne of Green Gables for this, so I'm going to go a different direction and pick Roch Carrier's Chandail de hockey, or The Hockey Sweater, which was written in the 70s but is set in the 40s and is about a boy in Quebec whose mother orders him a hockey jersey from the Eaton's catalog and gets a Leafs jersey in the mail instead of a Habs jersey. It's terrible. Anyway, it is very quintessentially Canadian. The National Film Board made a short film of this, both in French and in English, in 1980. And when I was in primary school, we actually watched it in class. I found it on YouTube, and I will link it below, both the English and French versions, if you want to check them out. It's only about 10 minutes, so yeah, there you go. Question number 3 is, what is a book from your country that you read in school? I'm going to mention 2, both of which I read in high school. One is Timothy Findley's The Wars, which is a kind of spectacular piece of what I guess you'd call historical metafiction. It's primarily about one man's experience during the First World War, but there is a kind of latticed framework, I would almost say. It keeps going back and forth to a researcher who's looking into these things. This is spectacular. This is a very non-linear and non-sanitized story. This is mud and blood and guts and brothels, and it's definitely one of my favorite things that I read in high school. I am also going to mention a book that I read not in an English class in high school, but in a history class, and that is Joy Kogawa's Obasan. I don't know how other people's Canadian history classes played out, but in mine, we actually never had time to get past about the 1930s. So if we hadn't been assigned this novel, I don't know how much we would have gotten about the 1940s and then the years afterwards. The sequel, Itsuka, has kind of blended with this one in my head, so I no longer remember exactly what happened in this one and what happened in the sequel. But I think together they tell both an important story about how Japanese Canadians were treated, but also a very compelling family story. Question number 4 is, what is a book set in your favorite area of your country? I wish I had a coffee table book that had pictures of Lake Louise, because that is definitely what I would hold up, because I think that's the most beautiful part of the country. But instead of that, I'm going to pick something that was set in a place that I saw almost every day when I read this, and that affected the way I saw that. And that is Michael Ondaatje's In the Skin of the Lion, which is set in 1930s Toronto. And one of the things that's happening during this is the Bloor Viaduct is under construction. And there's a point in here where a nun falls off the under construction Bloor Viaduct, and she's rescued by someone who grabs her before she falls to her death. At the time that I read this, I was regularly taking the subway across the Bloor Viaduct, and genuinely every time I looked up, because usually I was reading on the subway, but if I looked up as we were crossing it, I would think of that nun going off the side of it. And even now, I mean, I haven't lived in Toronto in more than 10 years now, but anytime I'm driving down the Don Valley Parkway and you look up and see it, I also think of the nun. It might not be my favorite place, but it's definitely a place that I'm familiar with and where the book really captured that, and now I think of this alongside the actual place. Although I do feel like I could also mention André Alexis's 15 Dogs, because a big part of that is set in the off-leash dog park in High Park in Toronto. And when I used to live in Burlington and we'd go to Toronto on the weekend to visit family, we used to stop there and walk our dog on that off-leash area. So I do have a fond memory of that as well. Question number 5 is, what is a historical fiction that is set in your country? And I have already mentioned 2 historical fictions set in my country. But I will also mention Fred Stenson's The Great Karoo, which is partially set in Alberta and partially set in South Africa. It is set during the Anglo-Boer War and is about a Métis man in the 1st Alberta Rifles. It's actually a really interesting play on what you expect and the relationships between the colonizer and the colonized and the oppressor and the oppressed, and the fluidity of those kinds of things. The main character is a guy who mostly passes for white, but there are moments where he does sort of come out of the ethnic closet and tells people that he's Métis. At one point he's doing tracking work, so they want, based on stereotypes, he was going to get promoted in the military because of that. And he's also in love with an Afrikaans-speaking woman who is in one of the concentration camps. And that kind of plays with our attitudes as well, because I think a lot of the notions of when you think of Afrikaans-speaking people in history, you think of them as the colonized. Whereas in the Anglo-Boer War, they were being starved out in these concentration camps. They were, in turn, colonized by the British. And in these scenes, it's horrible. And at the same time, you're sitting there thinking, well, their grandchildren are going to invent apartheid. So it definitely plays with expectations that way. I didn't think this was a brilliant book, but I thought it was a really interesting take on that. And given how many Canadian novels are set during the First World War, it was interesting to see something set in the Anglo-Boer War. Although speaking of the First World War, I will also mention Joseph Boyden's 3-Day Road, which I thought was quite excellent, and is about a First World War veteran in a canoe, having flashbacks, and also his aunt taking him home on this canoe, and her having flashbacks as well. Question number 6 is, what is a book by an Indigenous author from your country? One of my favorite books that I have read so far this year was Tracey Lindberg's Birdie, which is about a woman who is basically recovering from a lifetime of abuse and horrible personal events. As she lies in a bed in British Columbia after having gone there from northern Alberta, and her just trying to recover her mind and get in touch with her inner owl. This is not a straightforward linear story, and it's definitely about a lot of harsh issues, but it is definitely brilliant. And the main character is also looking for an actor from the Beachcombers, which, come on, that's super Canadian. And since I'm naming more than one book for everything, I will also mention Tomson Highway's Kiss of the Fur Queen, which is also a non-linear story that deals with a lot of heavy issues, and is also about Cree characters by a Cree author. This is about two brothers and their experiences in residential schools in the 50s and how that plays out later. One of the brothers ends up getting into sex work, and that part is set during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. You can imagine this is super depressing, but also quite powerful. Question number 7 is, what is a classic book from your country? Roch Carrier's La Guerre, Yes Sir, and yes, this is the same author who did The Hockey Sweater. This is about Francophone soldiers during the First World War. The comparison that I always hear people make for Americans is that, imagine if Faulkner was, instead of being an American from the South, was a French Canadian. I don't know how accurate that is, but that's the comparison that you hear if you see his books in American editions. And the other one that I will mention is Fifth Business by Robertson Davies. This is not just a classic that I think a lot of people read in high school or university. This is also one of my favorite books of all time. Book is the first in a trilogy. The second and third ones are called The Manticore and World of Wonders. This is about Jungian archetypes. This is about people who teach at posh schools, but not necessarily people who have the lives that I think you might imagine that they would have. This is about a First World War veteran who comes back from the war, kind of damaged, kind of obsessed with a woman from his small town that he grew up in. He lost a leg in the war, and it does an interesting thing that you don't see a lot of, in that he recovers, but not the super recovery, but it acknowledges that both of those things exist in reality. He has this fantastic idea of this woman that he's obsessed with, and I think a lesser author would have this guy rescue her, because this is a woman who is brain damaged. He does not rescue her. And when he eventually ends up in a final relationship, this isn't some trite, he has a housewife. He has a woman who is medically ugly, and he has a man who is the son of the woman he was obsessed with. And the three of them have their life together, which is not some standard played out. This is one of those, I think there are a lot of books that are sort of the canon just because they happen to be published at the right time, but I genuinely think this deserves all the praise it gets. I read this, I don't know, 25 years ago originally, and I still reread it almost every year, and I still think it's brilliant every time. Question number 8 is, what is a book from your country that you haven't read but would like to read? And I would like to read Vincent Lam's The Headmaster's Wager, which is a story set in Saigon in the 1960s about a Chinese-Vietnamese man who has a gambling problem and is in love with a French-Vietnamese woman. It is, I believe, loosely based on some of the author's family's history. Vincent Lam wrote Bloodletting and Miraculous Cures, which won the Guerre, but was honestly a bit trashy. It was sort of a physicians behaving badly kind of novel. And he's an emergency room doctor himself, so I think it felt that much more revealing because of that. But I'm definitely curious to see him write something that is apparently less soap opera-y. You may have noticed this doesn't sound like it's set in Canada. I actually consider a lot of writing that has Canada as an endpoint, even if it doesn't appear in the book itself, as being quintessentially Canadian. I mentioned that in the comments of Sean's video, where I said I do think that something like Madeleine Thien's Do Not Say We Have Nothing, which is 85% set in China, or something like Nino Ricci's The Lives of the Saints, which is completely set in Italy, or Shyam Selvadurais' Funny Boy, which is almost completely set in Sri Lanka, or even Rohinton Mistry's Family Matters, which is about a family that applies to immigrate to Canada, but isn't accepted, so they're staying in India. Canada isn't even the end point there. But I do feel like all of those are quintessentially Canadian. I definitely think that there is a certain cultural framework that being from a first or second generation immigrant family, especially if you're from a place like Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal, there is a feeling to that that comes across in all of those books. Question number 9, what are some of your favorite authors or books from your country? As I've already said, Robertson Davies is not only one of my favorite Canadian authors, but one of my favorite authors of all time. I think all of his books were brilliant. I think it's a shame he never got to finish the Toronto trilogy before he died. I think his opera was interesting. I have a couple of books of his writing on theater, which I think are, yes, pompous because he was like that. He went to Upper Canada College. He's that kind of posh, obnoxious person. But genuinely, I think, brilliant stuff. But to talk about some other people, I also love M.G. Vassanji's writing. I have talked about him quite a few times on this channel before. He writes primarily short stories and primarily set among the Ismaili diaspora, sometimes in Don Mills in Toronto, sometimes in Tanzania, sometimes in India. And I think he's brilliant. He's one of those writers who has a sense of place to his writing that always blows me away. And to mention a couple of writers of nonfiction, Tim Cook's First World War histories are brilliant. This is at the sharp end. He's also written Shock Troops. He's the First World War expert at the Canadian War Museum. And if you are interested in that period of military history or Canadian history, I definitely think his books are worth picking up. In terms of other writers, I also love Jan Wong's writing. I often disagree with the conclusions that she comes to, but I find her super compelling, and her Lunch with Jan Wong column, when it was running in the Globe and Mail, was genuinely my favorite thing. It was always a highlight of my week to go and read that column when it was coming out, which I know some people hate because it was a little bitchy towards the celebrities that she interviewed and went to lunch with, but I loved it. And I think that was the last question. So thank you very much to Sean for tagging me, and I'll need to tag a few more people. You know, I've seen a lot of people do this tag who are Canadian, Australian, and I've seen a couple of South Africans, but considering how many people on BookTube are American, I want to know why the Americans aren't doing this. I'm going to look up some names and tag a couple of people and insert that here. So yeah, who are your favorite Canadian writers? I'd be curious to hear. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.